Welcome back to the Grave of the Shadows. Before we begin, a huge thanks for your support. If you love the mystery, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell. Now, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's chilling tale. Deep in the misty hollows of Kentucky, there lies a cemetery that should never have existed. Hidden from the eyes of the world for over a century, it's a place where the innocent were laid to rest in secrecy, a graveyard known only to a few. Yet, beneath the veil of secrecy, this cemetery holds a chilling truth, one that not only shattered lives but redefined the very concept of mercy. The place is called the Garden of Purified Angels, though the name alone carries no comfort. Behind the peaceful, serene facade of that name lies a dark, unsettling truth. Over the course of 25 years, from 1834 to 1859, more than 150 infants were buried here. Tiny graves, concealed from the public eye, were the final resting places for those who were never meant to exist, according to 3 women who believed they were acting in the name of a higher power. Margaret, Catherine, and Agnes Morrison were renowned as midwives in southeastern Kentucky. Revered by the local population for their exceptional skill in delivering babies, they were trusted, beloved, and seen as angels sent to aid women in one of the most important moments of their lives. But what if I told you that these women, seemingly devoted to their faith and profession, secretly believed they were saving the world from a much darker threat? Behind closed doors, the sisters were carrying out a twisted, unspeakable mission disguised as mercy. Their so-called purifications were not acts of compassion, but murder, infanticide carried out under the guise of divine intervention. They believed that certain children, marked by physical flaws, were touched by evil and had to be purified before they could enter the world. This is the story of the Morrison Sisters, a story steeped in religious delusion, dark secrets, and the lives of the innocent who were sacrificed in the name of purity. But the truth was hidden for generations. It wasn't until a shocking discovery in 1856 that the twisted reality of their actions came to light. So, are you brave enough to uncover the full story? To learn the horrifying truth about the Morrison sisters' dark mission and their reign of terror that went unnoticed for over 2 decades? If you are, keep watching, and let's uncover the sinister secrets together. In the remote Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky, where the dense forests and harsh winters carved the land into a labyrinth of isolation, 3 women became an integral part of the local community. Margaret, Catherine, and Agnes Morrison were known throughout Harlan County for one thing: their skill in midwifery. For over 2 decades, they had helped bring new life into the world, revered by the people for their abilities and seen as sacred figures in an unforgiving land. The Morrison sisters weren't just midwives. They were healers, confidants, and spiritual guides. In a place where doctors were few and far between, these women were the only trusted hands to deliver babies in the rugged mountains. Many families didn't have the luxury of a physician. The sisters, who lived in a modest 2-story cabin perched on a ridge overlooking the Cumberland River, became the beacon of hope for expectant mothers in their communities. Their reputation spread across 3 counties, and people traveled from miles away, often in treacherous conditions, just to seek their expertise. Margaret, the eldest at 42, was seen as the spiritual leader of the trio. Tall and imposing, her appearance matched the gravity with which she took her work. Her graying hair was always pulled back into a severe bun, her pale blue eyes betraying the deep intensity of her beliefs. She was a devout Baptist, a woman who saw herself as an instrument of God's will, guiding both mother and child through the trials of birth. Her calm demeanor and unwavering faith in Scripture made her the most trusted and respected of the sisters. But behind her composed exterior, Margaret carried within her a darkness that would soon begin to grow. Catherine, 38, served as the practical backbone of the operation. Her sturdy frame and practical manner contrasted with her sisters' more spiritual personalities. Yet her role was just as vital. Catherine was the one who assisted during deliveries, managing the more hands-on aspects of childbirth. With a gentle touch and a calm presence, she quickly gained the trust of the mothers she helped. Her medical knowledge, though largely self-taught, was respected by the locals. Agnes, the youngest at 35, had an almost ethereal quality about her. With dark hair and large, expressive eyes, she exuded a beauty that was both angelic and unsettling. Agnes's soft voice and nurturing touch earned her the admiration of the community. But there was always something about her that felt off to those who knew her well. She was the one who had the deepest spiritual connection with the babies she delivered, often praying over them as they came into the world. But as the years passed, her perception of that connection would take a darker turn. The sisters lived a simple life, but one that was steeped in faith. They rose before dawn for private prayers, spent their mornings tending to their medicinal garden, and dedicated their afternoons to attending the needs of pregnant women. They were seen as pillars of the community, selflessly offering their services to families, often in exchange for livestock, vegetables, or simple household goods. They treated every delivery with reverence, but they were also driven by a sense of divine purpose, one that, over time, would become twisted beyond recognition. Their secluded home, located far from the nearest town, was both their residence and their medical facility. The lower floor had been transformed into a birthing room, equipped with specially crafted beds, surgical tools, and an extensive collection of herbs and remedies that they cultivated themselves. This was a place where life and death seemed to coexist, a place where women gave birth to their children and, unbeknownst to many, where the Morrison sisters would later decide who lived and who died. In these early years, the Morrison sisters were seen as nothing short of miracles. Their success rate in childbirth was unparalleled, and their gentle ministrations made them the most respected women in the area. People saw them as divine figures, sent by God to help the poor, the suffering, and the isolated. But even as they performed their duties with apparent sincerity, cracks began to appear in their worldview. And by the time they began to view themselves as the guardians of spiritual purity, no one could have foreseen the terrible path they would take. At first, the sisters' beliefs were rooted in a deep religious conviction. They led prayers during difficult deliveries, offered comforting words from Scripture, and believed that their work was in harmony with God's will. However, as their isolation grew, so did their distorted interpretation of faith. They began to see certain signs in newborns that others might dismiss as mere birthmarks or physical anomalies. To the Morrison sisters, these were marks of evil, signs that the child was not pure and, in their eyes, needed to be purified. It was during this time, as their belief system began to evolve, that the Morrison sisters crossed a line that would ultimately lead them down a horrific and irreversible path. They no longer saw themselves as mere midwives. They began to believe they were chosen by God to rid the world of children who were marked by darkness. The early years of the Morrison sisters' practice were marked by an overwhelming sense of devotion to their calling. Isolated in the Appalachian Mountains, they found themselves among a tight-knit, deeply religious community. Here, in a land where medical care was scarce, the sisters became an essential lifeline to the mothers and families around them. They weren't just midwives. They were trusted healers and spiritual guides who brought both comfort and skill to their work. Yet, it was during these formative years that the seeds of their eventual descent into darkness were unknowingly planted. The Morrison sisters had been raised in a devout Baptist household, where religion was not just a part of daily life. It was the very foundation upon which their existence was built. As children, they were taught to view the world through a lens of divine purpose, where every action, every thought, and every moment was guided by the will of God. It was this upbringing that initially made their role as midwives seem so natural. They weren't just delivering babies. They believed they were bringing new lives into the world for a reason, under the watchful eyes of a higher power. In the beginning, the Morrison sisters' approach to midwifery was straightforward and compassionate. Their skills were unmatched in the region. They had a natural talent for handling difficult births, and their careful attention to the needs of mothers made them beloved figures in the community. The sisters took pride in the work they did, and their deep faith only strengthened their resolve to help those in need. Their cabin, nestled on the edge of the Cumberland River, was an ideal location for a midwifery practice. The lower level of their two-story home was devoted entirely to birthing beds, tools, and medicinal herbs. They often worked by candlelight, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls as they assisted women in labor. The upper floor was a sanctuary, prayer rooms filled with scripture and intense personal reflection. Here, the sisters would turn to God for guidance, seeking answers for the mysteries of life and death that surrounded them daily. The early years were filled with success and respect. Women from all over the 3 counties they served came to them for help during childbirth. Many women considered it a blessing to have the Morrison sisters attend their deliveries, and their reputation only grew with time. The demand for their services grew, and soon they were regarded as the finest midwives in the entire region. Their devotion to their craft and their ability to provide comfort and healing seemed like a divine gift. However, even in these early years, there were hints of the psychological strain that would later define their work. Margaret, the eldest sister, was always the most devout and the most intense. Her faith bordered on fanaticism, and it was clear to some that her devotion to God often overshadowed her understanding of the needs of the people she was helping. Catherine, the more practical of the sisters, seemed to have an intuitive grasp of what was needed in a delivery. Yet, there was something unsettling in her adherence to Margaret's direction. And Agnes, the youngest, seemed to possess an ethereal, almost supernatural connection to the births she attended, often speaking of visions and signs she saw in the babies she helped bring into the world. While many of these traits could be attributed to their isolated environment, there was a growing sense of something more beneath the surface. In the beginning, the sisters saw their work as an extension of their faith, an opportunity to serve God and His will. They would pray over every child that was born, asking for divine protection and guidance for the new life. But as their practice grew, so too did their isolation from the world around them. They began to withdraw further into their religious beliefs, cutting themselves off from the influences of the outside world. This growing seclusion allowed their faith to evolve into something more extreme, something darker. They began to look at certain children born with physical imperfections, birthmarks, irregularities in skin tone, or unusual features, and interpret these as signs of demonic influence. At first, these were simply moments of concern, brief flickers of doubt that the sisters pushed aside. But over time, these concerns began to form the foundation of a belief system that would soon justify their actions. They began to see themselves not as mere midwives but as chosen agents of divine judgment. To them, their work was no longer just about assisting in the miracle of birth. They believed they were protecting the world from evil, from children born with marks of the devil. What had started as compassionate care began to morph into something far more sinister. The tipping point came when one of the sisters, likely Margaret, began to perceive divine messages in the appearance of birthmarks. A strawberry birthmark, once thought to be a harmless imperfection, was now seen as a mark of evil. A port wine stain on a child's cheek became a sign of spiritual corruption. What had once been a harmless birth defect was now seen as evidence of demonic possession. Slowly but surely, the sisters began to convince themselves that their mission was not just to deliver babies, but to eliminate those they believed were marked by the devil. As they became more entrenched in this belief system, the sisters' practice of midwifery began to shift. They no longer just cared for mothers, they began to make decisions about which children would live and which would die. What had once been a revered and respected practice of saving lives was now a system built on fear, fanaticism, and death. And so, the sisters began their descent into the darkness, driven by their misguided sense of righteousness and their belief that they were chosen by God to rid the world of evil. It was a bitter February night in 1834 when the first act of purification took place in the Morrison Sisters' cabin. The wind howled through the mountain pass, rattling the windows of their modest home, while snow piled up against the door, trapping the family inside. The cabin, dimly lit by the flickering flames of a hearth fire, should have been a sanctuary for the weary mother, Sarah Mackenzie, who had been in labor for hours. But this night, this birth, would mark the beginning of something far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Sarah Mackenzie, a young woman expecting her first child, had been in the care of the Morrison sisters for days. Her labor had been long and exhausting, a test of her strength and endurance. The sisters worked tirelessly to provide comfort, with Margaret offering steady words of reassurance, Catherine tending to Sarah's physical needs, and Agnes, ever the spiritual presence, whispering prayers and reading scripture over the expectant mother. The entire process was shrouded in a sense of calm and devotion, at least on the surface. Margaret, always the calm leader, stood at the foot of the bed, overseeing the delivery. She had assisted in countless births before, but this one felt different. As Sarah's pain grew more intense, Margaret's attention began to drift, her mind wandering into darker thoughts. It wasn't the labor that troubled her, but the small birthmark on the infant's forehead that caught her eye. It wasn't large, but it was dark, and the irregular shape seemed to pulse in the dim lamplight. Something about it unsettled Margaret. She had seen many children born with marks on their skin, but this mark felt different, something more sinister. As the baby was born, crying loudly into the cold night air, Agnes was the first to hold it. Her eyes, usually filled with warmth and empathy, now narrowed with something else, something darker. She cradled the infant gently, her fingers tracing the small birthmark on his forehead. The mark was dark and irregularly shaped, resembling a handprint. A devil's handprint, she thought to herself, as a chill ran down her spine. She didn't speak, but her silence spoke volumes. Margaret moved closer, her sharp eyes narrowing as she examined the mark more closely. To her growing horror, she saw patterns in the mark, lines and curves that seemed almost unnatural. As her hand trembled over the baby's tiny face, she whispered a prayer, asking God to reveal the truth. The mark, she believed, was no ordinary birthmark. It was a sign of the devil's influence, a clear indication that this child was born marked by evil. The baby, still squirming in Agnes's arms, seemed to grow quieter as the sisters exchanged a glance. Sarah, exhausted from the pain of labor, weakly called out, asking if her baby was all right. She could barely keep her eyes open, her mind clouded by exhaustion. But as she called for her child, the sisters' silence spoke louder than any words they could have said. Margaret moved to Agnes's side, her heart racing. She knew, deep down, that what they were about to do was not the mercy of a midwife but the judgment of God. She had prayed for guidance, and now she believed God had given it to her. The child was marked by the devil, and it was their responsibility to protect the world from his evil. They had to purify him. With a trembling hand, Margaret gently took the baby from Agnes's arms. She could feel the weight of the infant's small body in her hands, his warmth, his life. But to her, it was not a life to be celebrated. It was a life that had already been claimed by darkness, and she was the one chosen to set it free. The baby struggled briefly, a faint cry escaping its lips, before falling still in Margaret's arms. For a moment, everything seemed to stop: time, the storm outside, the very air in the cabin. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, her hands shaking as she gently placed the baby back in the crib. It was over. They had purified him. As Sarah awoke hours later, still weak from childbirth, Margaret approached her bedside with a carefully practiced, sorrowful expression. "I'm so sorry, dear," Margaret said softly, her voice heavy with false sympathy. "Your baby was born with severe complications. His spirit was called home to be with the Lord before he could suffer in this world." Her words were comforting, soothing, but hollow. She wasn't mourning. She was relieved. Sarah, too exhausted to question, accepted the explanation, her mind too clouded by the pain of childbirth. She was told that her child had died in a moment of peace, spared from the harsh realities of the world. Margaret spoke of God's mysterious ways, of the blessing that Sarah's child would now rest in heaven, free from earthly trials. That night, under the cover of snow and darkness, the sisters carried the baby's tiny body to the back of their cabin. They buried him in a small grave behind the house, marking the spot with a simple wooden cross. Margaret, her hands still shaking, wrote the first entry in the journal that would document every subsequent purification. February 12, 1834. Purified one, marked by darkness. The Lord's work continues. And so it began. As the months passed after the first act of purification, the Morrison sisters' conviction in their mission only grew stronger. What had begun as a single, isolated event, a decision made in the heat of religious fervor, slowly transformed into a deep-seated belief that they were, in fact, the chosen agents of God's divine judgment. The isolated mountain setting, far from the watchful eyes of the outside world, allowed their delusions to fester without interference. It was here, in the quiet solitude of their cabin, that their interpretation of Scripture began to twist in ways that would ultimately justify the unthinkable. Margaret, the eldest and most devout, led the way. As she pored over the Bible each evening, her interpretation of the text grew more extreme. What had once been comforting passages about salvation and grace began to take on darker meanings. Her once firm belief in the sanctity of all life became tainted by the idea that certain lives, specifically those of children marked with physical imperfections, were inherently evil. The birthmarks, once seen as mere cosmetic anomalies, were now perceived as literal marks of the devil. A strawberry birthmark was no longer an innocent variation. It was a sign of bloodthirsty tendencies. A port wine stain was not just a skin condition but a mark of spiritual corruption. In Margaret's fevered imagination, these birthmarks weren't just random blemishes. They were symbols of something far more sinister. They were, in her mind, the visible manifestation of the darkness that had already taken root in the soul. This warped belief quickly gained traction among her sisters, who, though initially uncertain, began to adopt Margaret's views with alarming ease. The sisters no longer saw themselves as humble midwives. They saw themselves as guardians of purity, protectors of the world from the evil that lurked in the hearts of children. Catherine, the practical one, had always been the more grounded of the three. Her role as the physical backbone of their midwifery practice was indispensable, and she had earned the trust of the community with her steady hands and reliable presence. But even Catherine couldn't escape the growing influence of Margaret's religious fervor. Though she questioned Margaret's increasingly radical views, Catherine was drawn into the belief system that was slowly taking hold. At first, she resisted, unwilling to believe that their work had shifted from healing to something much darker. But as the months wore on, Catherine found herself aligning more with Margaret's increasingly twisted interpretation of divine will. The more she questioned, the more Margaret's soothing words seemed to answer her doubts. And so, Catherine, too, became a willing participant in their sacred mission. Agnes, the youngest, was the most vulnerable to Margaret's growing delusions. Always the most spiritually inclined of the three, Agnes seemed to possess an almost supernatural connection to the newborns she helped deliver. She often spoke of visions and divine messages, and her ethereal beauty added to the sense that she was somehow touched by something otherworldly. Where Margaret led, Agnes followed without hesitation. It was Agnes who, more than any of the others, began to interpret every child's birthmark, every physical anomaly, as a sign of something more. A spiritual wound, an indelible mark of evil that needed to be purged. The three sisters began to spend hours in prayer, seeking divine guidance to further clarify their mission. They would pray over each newborn, asking for God's intervention to protect them from the perceived evil that existed in the world. But their prayers slowly evolved. What had once been prayers for protection became increasingly focused on the elimination of those they believed were marked. They began to see themselves as instruments of God's wrath, chosen to rid the world of these cursed children. They prayed not for the survival of the babies but for their purification, believing they were performing a necessary act to prevent evil from spreading. With each passing day, their belief system grew more elaborate. They began to catalog the physical characteristics that they believed marked a child as evil: birthmarks, deformities, even the color of a child's skin. They saw these signs as evidence of demonic influence, and they began to create a detailed system for identifying these tainted children. In their minds, these children were beyond redemption, destined to spread corruption and darkness throughout the world. It was their duty to stop that from happening. The first victim of this new belief system was a child born to a local family, whose birthmark was deemed by the sisters to be a sign of the devil's hand. The child's parents, trusting in the sisters' expertise, never questioned their actions. They were told that the baby had been born with internal defects that could not be corrected, a lie that would become all too familiar in the years to come. The sisters led the grieving parents through their usual rituals of comfort, presenting the child's death as a mercy, a divine intervention that saved the child from a life of suffering and sin. By now, the sisters had developed a method for carrying out the purifications. They would first dismiss the parents from the room, claiming that the baby needed private medical care. Once alone, they would perform their ritual, often suffocating the infant or administering fatal doses of sedatives. The process was quick and quiet, and the sisters were careful to ensure that no one ever discovered the truth behind the deaths. Each time, they recorded their actions in the journal Margaret had begun. The entries were filled with religious language, using scripture to justify their actions. Purification, they called it. Saving the soul, they said. They convinced themselves that they were not murderers but protectors, sent by God to do His will. They believed that the pain they caused was for a greater good, a higher calling that no one could understand. The deaths were a sacrifice, a necessary cleansing of the world from the evil they saw in these children. With each new death, the Morrison sisters became more convinced that they were fulfilling a divine mission. Their belief in their righteousness was unshakable, and they were emboldened by the community's trust. The more they killed, the more they justified their actions, and the more deeply they sank into the delusions that had taken hold of them. By 1835, what had started as isolated acts of infanticide disguised as mercy began to solidify into a well-established and methodical system, the Morrison Sisters' so-called purification system. The more the sisters carried out these secretive killings, the more organized and refined their process became. They no longer relied on the fleeting moments of emotional impulse or religious fervor that had marked their first act of murder. Instead, they developed a strict set of criteria, a checklist of physical characteristics, that would determine which children would be purified. It was no longer about a fleeting moment of doubt. It was a calculated decision, made with chilling precision. It all began with the birthmarks. Margaret, who had once merely glanced at a child's birthmark with suspicion, began to see these marks as concrete evidence of evil. No longer seen as natural imperfections, birthmarks were now indicators of something far darker, marks of the devil's influence. The sisters created an elaborate system for classifying these marks, cataloging every perceived flaw that might indicate a child was born tainted. The first type of mark, and perhaps the most troubling in the sisters' eyes, was what they referred to as the devil's handprint. This was a mark on the forehead or face that appeared irregular, dark, or unusually shaped. Agnes, with her heightened sensitivity to spiritual matters, was the first to recognize what she considered demonic patterns in these birthmarks. The marks themselves, she believed, were like the hand of Satan himself, leaving its trace on the child's skin as a sign of ownership. A crescent-shaped birthmark, which often appeared on the cheek or neck, was classified as a sign of spiritual impurity, linked to violence or bloodlust. The sisters believed that this particular mark was a direct manifestation of the evil that lurked within the child. The second category was based on skin imperfections such as port wine stains, strawberry birthmarks, and other visible defects. These marks were seen as signs of corruption that could not be cleansed. To Margaret, Catherine, and Agnes, the presence of any unusual skin markings was not a medical condition. It was a message. These marks were the clearest indicators that the child had been touched by darkness, destined to bring evil into the world. By 1835, the sisters had expanded their criteria to include physical deformities, such as cleft palates, extra fingers or toes, and other variations from what they considered to be the natural human form. These characteristics, which had once been understood by the community as part of human diversity or genetic variation, were now viewed as marks of demonic interference. Any child born with such physical differences was automatically deemed a threat to the spiritual purity of the community. But it wasn't just physical features that determined who would live and who would die. The sisters also began to rely on a more abstract criterion: the spiritual presence of the child. It was Agnes, with her mystical and sometimes eerie connection to the children she helped deliver, who would often make the final decision. If she sensed an evil aura or demonic energy, the child would be subjected to purification. In these moments, Agnes became the judge, jury, and executioner, deciding who was worthy of life and who must be eradicated. The purification system was meticulous. The sisters would use every moment of the delivery to observe and assess the infant. Margaret, the most vocal and authoritative of the three, would often lead the ritual, confirming the child's status according to their newly established criteria. Catherine, ever the practical one, would prepare the tools they needed to carry out the purification. Often, they would ask the mother to leave the room for medical reasons, a claim they used to justify the privacy of the process. The trusting mothers, exhausted from labor, rarely questioned the sisters' requests. If a child passed the sisters' inspection and was deemed pure, they would be returned to the mother, and the birth would be celebrated. But if the child was deemed tainted, the purification began almost immediately. The methods of purification were, at first, simple strangulation or suffocation were the primary tools used. Margaret, believing that they were doing God's work, would often pray over the child before delivering the fatal blow. The baby's struggles were brief, and the entire process was done quickly and quietly, with the sisters ensuring that the death was as discreet as possible. They had learned the art of deception well, and would later explain the infant's death to the grieving parents as a result of complications or internal defects. The more the sisters executed their purifications, the more the system became refined. They began to keep detailed records of their actions. Margaret would write in the journal she had begun in 1834, documenting every death and its supposed justification. Each entry was carefully scripted, written with a mixture of religious fervor and clinical detachment. Purified, she would write, marked by darkness, saved from a life of evil. Each baby's death was catalogued with such precision. It was as if the sisters saw themselves as conducting an official, divine duty rather than committing murder. As the system grew, so did the sisters' arrogance. They became more and more convinced of their righteousness, believing that God Himself had chosen them for this task. To the outside world, they were still seen as compassionate midwives, skilled in the delicate art of childbirth. But behind closed doors, they had become something else entirely. They were the keepers of life and death, the ones who had the power to decide who was worthy of living and who was not. By the time the sisters had refined their purification system, they were operating with chilling efficiency. They had gone from acting on impulses driven by religious hysteria to a cold, systematic approach to murder. The more children they purified, the more they justified their actions, until the line between saving lives and taking them had become so blurred that they could no longer see the difference. What had begun as a misguided belief had now evolved into a deadly routine, one that would continue for years, leaving a trail of innocent lives lost in its wake. For over 2 decades, the Morrison Sisters carried out their horrific mission without interference. Their system of purification became increasingly sophisticated, and with each passing year, they grew more confident in their ability to hide their dark deeds behind the facade of respected midwives. Their reputation in the community continued to grow, and the deaths of the infants they purified were never questioned. That is, until a man named Dr. James Whitmore began to notice a disturbing pattern in the infant mortality rates of the region. Dr. Whitmore was not an outsider. He had lived in Harlan County for many years, practicing medicine in the town. He had treated many families in the area, and his medical knowledge was highly regarded. But it was his attention to detail and his commitment to scientific rigor that led him to begin questioning the growing number of infant deaths in the communities served by the Morrison Sisters. He had heard stories of these so-called miraculous deliveries, but there was always something that didn't sit right with him. As he gathered more and more data, the numbers told a chilling story. Dr. Whitmore began compiling statistics from local birth and death records. He was a meticulous man, driven by a sense of duty to his patients and a growing sense of unease. The patterns were impossible to ignore. Babies delivered by the Morrison Sisters had a higher-than-average mortality rate, especially those born with birthmarks or physical deformities. What was most disturbing was the fact that these infants often died suddenly, under mysterious circumstances. No clear cause of death was ever given, and the families were consistently told that the babies had been born with internal complications or defects that made survival impossible. Dr. Whitmore's suspicions grew, But he knew that suspicion alone was not enough to uncover the truth. What bothered him most, however, was not just the high death rate, but the secrecy that surrounded it. The Morrison sisters, who were trusted figures in the community, had no trouble explaining away the deaths. To many families, the idea that a baby might die due to mysterious causes was sadly accepted, given the high infant mortality rate in the region. But Dr. Whitmore could not shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. As a physician, he had seen many complications in childbirth, but the frequency with which babies died in the Morrison sisters' care seemed far too high to be coincidental. Driven by his growing concern, Dr. Whitmore began to ask questions. He spoke to families who had lost children while under the care of the Morrison sisters. Some of them had accepted the explanations given to them by the sisters, but others were troubled by the secrecy that surrounded their children's deaths. When Dr. Whitmore pressed them for details, he uncovered a disturbing pattern. Many of the families described how the sisters had insisted on handling the burial arrangements privately, often claiming that the babies' deaths were too painful for the grieving mothers to bear. In some cases, parents never even saw their children's bodies after death. The sisters made all the arrangements, and the families were left to grieve without closure or answers. Dr. Whitmore's investigation soon turned into an obsession. He collected testimonies from families who had lost children under the Morrison sisters' care. The more he delved into the records, the more alarming the evidence became. He cross-referenced birthmarks and physical abnormalities with the deaths, and the patterns were undeniable. Babies born with what the sisters considered demonic birthmarks had a much higher mortality rate than those born without. Dr. Whitmore could not explain this with medical science, and it soon became clear that the deaths were not the result of natural causes. Something far darker was at work. As Dr. Whitmore's suspicions grew stronger, he began to take action. He interviewed more families, examined more birth and death certificates, and sought out the truth. But even as he pieced together the evidence, he realized that the full extent of the Morrison sisters' actions might be more horrifying than he could have imagined. The idea that the sisters, beloved members of the community, might be responsible for the deaths of so many innocent children seemed impossible to believe. But the facts were staring him in the face. In the spring of 1856, Dr. Whitmore made a crucial breakthrough. While attending a Methodist revival meeting, he crossed paths with Mary Catherine Sullivan, a woman whose story would become the key to exposing the Morrison sisters' horrific deeds. Mary Catherine, now a mother of 3, had been a victim of the sisters' twisted mission years earlier. She was the mother of one of their purified infants, the first victim to be suffocated by the Morrison sisters. Mary Catherine had never forgotten the day her child had died under the sisters' care, nor the strange behavior she had witnessed. In 1847, her daughter had been born with a small strawberry birthmark on her shoulder. The Morrison sisters, already convinced of the child's spiritual impurity, had taken the baby away for medical treatment, while Mary Catherine remained unaware of what was happening. When she was finally allowed to hold her baby, she found her child cold and lifeless, with no explanation from the sisters as to why she had died. The sisters claimed it was a complication, but Mary Catherine's instincts told her otherwise. When Mary Catherine learned that Dr. Whitmore was investigating infant deaths in the region, she finally found someone who would listen to her. She recounted the events of her child's death in vivid detail, confirming what Dr. Whitmore had suspected all along. The baby had been murdered. Mary Catherine's testimony, combined with Dr. Whitmore's research, became the first breakthrough in what would become a full-blown investigation into the Morrison sisters' reign of terror. For the first time, the truth began to unravel. The community's trust in the Morrison sisters, built over decades, was about to be shattered. But it was only the beginning. The real horror would soon come to light. By the spring of 1856, the first cracks in the Morrison sisters' seemingly untouchable facade had begun to show. The investigation, spearheaded by Dr. Whitmore and fueled by the testimony of Mary Catherine Sullivan, was slowly unraveling the sisters' horrifying secret. But it wasn't until the search for physical evidence began that the true extent of their crimes came to light. Dr. Whitmore, now convinced that something far more sinister was at play, had a singular goal: to find the truth, no matter how disturbing it might be. For weeks, Dr. Whitmore had been digging into the patterns of infant mortality in the region, cross-referencing birth and death records, and speaking to families who had lost children under the Morrison sisters' care. His efforts had been met with resistance, as many in the community were still in denial about the possibility of their beloved midwives being anything other than benevolent healers. But as the evidence mounted, the need for answers grew more urgent. There was only one way to confirm his suspicions: by searching the land surrounding the Morrison sisters' cabin. Mary Catherine's testimony had been crucial in pinpointing the area behind the sisters' cabin where she believed her son had been secretly buried. She recalled vague details of the burial site: a small grave, marked with a simple wooden cross behind the cabin. Dr. Whitmore knew that this was the key to exposing the sisters' crime. But the task of finding such a site in the dense Appalachian wilderness, where small graves could easily be hidden from prying eyes, was no easy feat. In late summer 1856, Dr. Whitmore enlisted the help of Sheriff William Hayes and several deputies to search the sisters' property. Armed with a warrant, the group set out to examine the area behind the cabin where Mary Catherine had claimed her child had been buried. The sisters, now in their 60s and showing signs of the psychological strain their actions had caused, seemed to sense that something was amiss, but they were still too confident in their long-standing position in the community to worry about the possibility of discovery. As they made their way to the back of the cabin, the air was thick with anticipation. The small graveyard was well concealed by dense woods and undergrowth, as if the land itself had conspired to hide the truth. Yet, as the search party began to carefully examine the ground, it didn't take long before the first signs of disturbed earth appeared. The soil around the area looked freshly churned, an oddity in a place that had been untouched by human hands for years. At first, they thought it might be a trick of the light or a natural occurrence, but as they dug deeper, the truth became undeniable. Beneath the surface, they found the skeletal remains of a child. Tiny bones, fragile and worn by time, were uncovered one by one, each one revealing the horrific reality of what had taken place. Sheriff Hayes' heart sank as he realized the gravity of what they had uncovered. As the digging continued, more bodies were unearthed, one after another. Each grave was small, the remains of infants no more than a few months old. Some of the bones showed signs of deformities: cleft palates, extra fingers or toes, physical traits the Morrison sisters had come to consider marks of evil. The ground behind the cabin had become a macabre cemetery, a secret resting place for over 100 children who had been suffocated by the very hands that had been entrusted with their care. The most chilling discovery came when they unearthed a collection of crude wooden crosses. Each one marked the burial site of a child who had been laid to rest in this hidden graveyard. Some of the crosses were weathered and broken, their inscriptions faded beyond recognition, but others were still intact, bearing the names of the infants and the dates of their deaths. This grim memorial told the story of a system that had been operating in the shadows for years, its victims buried and forgotten by a community that had been blinded by trust. The realization that the Morrison sisters had not only committed these murders but had kept detailed records of them made the discovery all the more horrifying. Each infant's death had been meticulously documented in Margaret's journal. The sisters had maintained their cruel system for over 2 decades, burying their victims in secret, each one justified as part of their divine mission. The journal entries were filled with religious language, passages from scripture, prayers for the purification of the souls they believed were marked by evil. As the search party unearthed more bodies, the full scope of the Morrison sisters' crime became clear. There were at least 156 graves in total, each one representing a life taken in the name of a twisted belief. The sisters had been operating with impunity, hiding their actions behind their position as trusted midwives and religious guides. The shock and horror of the discovery reverberated throughout the community. Families who had once trusted the Morrison sisters to deliver their children were now left to grapple with the horrifying possibility that their babies had been murdered, their deaths hidden behind a veil of false compassion. The truth had finally been exposed, and the town was forever changed. For Dr. Whitmore, the discovery was both a victory and a tragedy. He had finally uncovered the evidence that confirmed his suspicions. But at what cost? The number of lives lost, the families destroyed, and the extent of the sisters' deceit were all too much to bear. The investigation had only just begun, but one thing was certain: the Morrison sisters' reign of terror was over. The world would now know the truth. The discovery of the secret cemetery behind the Morrison sisters' cabin was the catalyst that began the unraveling of their horrific reign of terror. With the shocking evidence uncovered, the community was in a state of disbelief. The idea that the beloved midwives, who had been trusted to assist in one of life's most sacred moments, were responsible for over 150 infant deaths was almost too monstrous to grasp. But the evidence was undeniable, and soon the Morrison sisters were arrested. The trial that followed would become one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in Kentucky's history. The courtroom, filled with spectators from all over the region, was a grim theater where the darkest secrets of the Morrison sisters were laid bare for the world to see. News of their arrest and the ensuing trial spread like wildfire, attracting reporters and onlookers from nearby towns and even distant cities. The Morrison sisters, once revered as pillars of the community, were now at the center of a public spectacle that would change the course of their lives forever. Margaret, Catherine, and Agnes were charged with multiple counts of murder, though the exact number of charges was difficult to pin down due to the secretive nature of their crimes. While the evidence of the bodies they had buried was irrefutable, proving individual cases of murder for every infant was a challenge. Many of the families had already accepted the sisters' false explanations and believed the children had died of natural causes. The secrecy of the burials and the vast passage of time made it nearly impossible to provide a complete list of victims. The prosecution, led by Commonwealth Attorney Robert Sterling, was determined to bring the full weight of the law down on the sisters. Sterling presented a methodical case, focusing on the detailed journal entries Margaret had kept over the years. These entries, filled with religious justifications for each purification, were damning. Margaret's own words, written in careful, measured script, painted a picture of a woman who had come to believe that she was an instrument of divine judgment. The prosecutor used these journal entries to demonstrate the cold, calculated nature of the sisters' actions. Each murder, each death, had been justified in their minds as part of a divine mission to rid the world of evil. Dr. Whitmore's testimony was equally crucial. As the physician who had conducted the investigation and uncovered the statistical anomalies in the infant mortality rates, Dr. Whitmore's knowledge was vital to the prosecution's case. His testimony helped explain how the sisters had used their position of authority to manipulate grieving families, convincing them that their children had died from natural causes or divine will. He described the methods used by the Morrison sisters to eliminate children they deemed marked, and how they systematically carried out their purifications over decades. But it was Mary Catherine Sullivan's testimony that became the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She had been the first to see through the sisters' deception, and her story of watching her own son die at their hands struck a chord with the jury. Mary Catherine's vivid recollection of her child's death, coupled with her courage in finally speaking out, made her a powerful witness. She spoke of how the Morrison sisters had acted with such calm authority during the birth of her son and how, after his death, they had manipulated her grief-stricken state to convince her that it was all part of God's plan. Her testimony was a devastating blow to the defense and solidified the prosecution's case. The defense, led by attorney Jonathan Morrison, no relation to the defendants, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against the sisters was overwhelming, and their confessions, both written and verbal, had already established their guilt. The defense strategy focused on trying to mitigate the sisters' actions by arguing that their mental state had been severely affected by their religious delusions. They portrayed the Morrison sisters as women driven by misguided faith, convinced that they were carrying out God's will. Several character witnesses testified to the sisters' piety, describing them as devout women who had dedicated their lives to helping others. But the defense's argument that the sisters had been driven to commit their heinous acts by religious mania did little to sway the jury. As the trial continued, the emotional tension in the courtroom grew. The victims' families, who had once trusted the Morrison sisters, were now forced to confront the horrifying possibility that their children had been murdered. Some were angry, others were grief-stricken, and many were overwhelmed by the sense of betrayal. The community that had once revered these women was now torn apart by the enormity of their actions. Margaret, who had always maintained her religious conviction, took the stand in her own defense. Speaking with the same calm authority that had once earned her the trust of the community, she explained her belief that she was performing a sacred duty. She quoted scripture extensively, justifying the murders as acts of divine intervention. "We were instruments of God's mercy," Margaret declared, her voice unwavering. "We saved these children from lives of sin, from the evil that would have consumed them." Her words, though calm and measured, had a chilling effect on those in the courtroom. It was clear that Margaret did not see herself as a murderer. She saw herself as a martyr, a woman who had been chosen to carry out God's will. Catherine, the more reserved of the sisters, was visibly distraught during the trial. She broke down under questioning, sobbing uncontrollably as she confessed to her role in the killings. While she maintained that she had only followed Margaret's lead, her admission of guilt was a significant blow to the defense. Agnes, the youngest sister, showed the least remorse. She sat stoically in the courtroom, refusing to accept that what they had done was wrong. She continued to insist that their actions had been justified and that they had been carrying out a holy mission. The trial came to a close after several weeks of intense testimony. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges for all 3 sisters. The speed with which the jury reached its decision reflected both the overwhelming evidence against the Morrison sisters and the horror of their crimes. Judge Harrison Caldwell sentenced Margaret Morrison to death by hanging. He called her actions an abomination against both God and humanity. Catherine and Agnes received life sentences, though their punishment was no less severe. The judge made it clear that their crimes had been just as monstrous as Margaret's and that they, too, would pay the price for their actions. The execution of Margaret Morrison on October 15, 1857, was witnessed by thousands. The news of her death reverberated throughout the country, and the trial of the Morrison sisters became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked religious fervor and the abuse of power. Margaret's last words, spoken on the gallows, were a prayer, asking for forgiveness and expressing confidence that God would reward her for her faithful service. But the families of the victims would never be able to forgive the sisters for what they had done. The trial of the Morrison sisters, and their subsequent convictions, sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. The revelation of their grisly crimes, acts that had been carried out under the guise of divine intervention, was a devastating blow to the families who had trusted them. The emotional and psychological toll of their actions was far-reaching, affecting not just the immediate families of the victims, but the entire community that had revered the sisters for so many years. For the families who had lost children to the sisters' purifications, the psychological damage was profound. Many of them had spent years grieving under false pretenses, believing their infants had died of natural causes or divine will. The Morrison sisters had manipulated their grief, playing on their religious faith and convincing them that their babies had been spared a life of suffering. Now, with the truth finally revealed, these families were left to confront the brutal reality. Their children had been murdered in cold blood. The grief they had worked so hard to process was reignited, this time with the added burden of betrayal. The emotional weight was particularly heavy for the mothers who had trusted the Morrison sisters with their pregnancies. Sarah Mackenzie, who had been one of the first to lose a child to the sisters' hands, could barely process the news when she learned of the sisters' arrest. Her memories of her baby's death, already tinged with sadness, were now clouded with anger and disbelief. She had been told her baby had died peacefully in his sleep, spared from suffering. But now, with the truth uncovered, she was forced to reckon with the fact that her child's death had been nothing more than an execution. The psychological impact was not limited to the grieving families. The entire community had been duped into believing the Morrison sisters were pious women, performing a sacred service for the greater good. The revelation that they had been committing infanticide in secret, under the guise of religious purification, left many questioning their judgment and the power they had given to these trusted figures. The Morrison sisters had been seen as angels sent to help bring new life into the world, but now they were exposed as monsters who had used their position of trust to carry out their dark mission. The community struggled to reconcile the women they had revered with the murderers they now saw them to be. As news of the trial spread, the psychological damage extended beyond the community. People across the nation were horrified by the sisters' crimes, and the case became a grim reminder of the dangers of blind faith and the abuse of power. The idea that 3 women, believed to be devoted to God and to helping others, could commit such horrific acts in the name of religion was a chilling thought. It raised questions about the role of religious authority, the power of medical professionals, and the vulnerability of those who placed their trust in these figures. How could they have been so blind? How could they have missed the signs? For Dr. Whitmore, the man who had first investigated the unusual patterns in infant mortality rates and ultimately helped expose the sisters, the psychological impact was equally profound. He had uncovered the truth, but at what cost? In his mind, the deaths of these innocent children were a direct result of the power the Morrison sisters had held over their community. His discovery had brought justice for the victims, but it had also brought back the suffering and anguish of the families who had trusted the sisters. Dr. Whitmore found himself haunted by the knowledge that, had he acted sooner, some of these deaths might have been prevented. For the Morrison sisters, the consequences of their actions were equally devastating. Margaret, the ringleader of the operation, was executed by hanging on October 15, 1857. As she stood on the gallows, she maintained that she had been carrying out God's will, believing that her actions had been justified. Her last words, spoken with unwavering conviction, were a prayer asking for forgiveness for her faithful service. She truly believed she had done the right thing, and in the end, she was convinced that she would be rewarded for her dedication to God. But in the eyes of the community and the law, Margaret had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Her execution was a public spectacle, watched by thousands who came to witness the end of one of Kentucky's most notorious criminals. Catherine, the middle sister, was sentenced to life in prison. During her trial, she had broken down, sobbing uncontrollably as she confessed to her role in the murders. She insisted that she had only followed Margaret's lead, and while her remorse seemed genuine, it did little to mitigate the horror of her actions. Catherine spent the rest of her days in prison, tormented by the memories of what she had been a part of. She died in 1864 from a combination of tuberculosis and what prison officials described as a complete mental breakdown. Agnes, the youngest sister, remained steadfast in her belief that she had done nothing wrong. She continued to insist that the children they had purified had been saved from lives of evil and suffering. Agnes spent 14 years in prison before her death in 1871. Unlike her sisters, Agnes never expressed remorse for her actions. She died unrepentant, still convinced that she and her sisters had performed a sacred duty. The legacy of the Morrison sisters lives on, not just in the infamy of their crimes but in the lasting psychological scars they left behind. For the families who lost children, for the community that trusted them, and for the generations that followed, the sisters' actions served as a dark reminder of how easily good intentions can be twisted into something far more dangerous. The sisters had used their position of power to exploit the trust of those who depended on them, and in doing so, they left a trail of destruction that would echo through history. The secret cemetery behind their cabin was eventually consecrated as a proper burial ground, with each tiny grave marked by a headstone bearing the inscription, "Unknown child, victim of madness." But for many, the Morrison sisters' legacy remains a chilling testament to the dangers of unchecked authority, fanaticism, and the abuse of trust. The case of the Morrison sisters serves as one of the darkest chapters in American history, a story of religious delusion, unchecked power, and the tragic loss of innocent lives. For over 2 decades, these women, once revered as trusted midwives, carried out a series of murders under the guise of divine intervention. Their belief that they were acting in the name of God led them to take the lives of over 150 children, all in the name of purification. But in the end, their twisted mission came to a halt, and the truth behind their actions was exposed for all to see. What makes their story so chilling is not just the cruelty of their actions, but the way they were able to manipulate an entire community into believing their false justifications. The Morrison sisters were seen as angels, devout women who helped bring new life into the world. But beneath that image, they had built a system of death, one that had been allowed to persist for far too long. The community trusted them, and that trust was ultimately shattered in the most devastating way. The psychological impact of the sisters' actions was far-reaching. The families who had lost children were forced to confront the brutal reality of what had happened. For some, it meant reopening old wounds. For others, it meant the realization that their children had been taken from them under false pretenses. The Morrison sisters' reign of terror left scars that would last a lifetime. But perhaps the most haunting lesson from this story is the reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority. The Morrison sisters used their position of trust and their religious beliefs to justify their actions, manipulating the very people who depended on them. They convinced themselves that what they were doing was righteous, but in the end, they were nothing more than murderers who had exploited their power for years. As we reflect on the story of the Morrison sisters, we are reminded that no person, no matter how trusted or revered, should ever be allowed to wield unchecked power. The legacy of the Morrison sisters is a stark reminder of how easily faith can be manipulated, how trust can be exploited, and how darkness can hide behind the most benevolent facades. The names of the 156 innocent children who were taken from the world too soon will forever be remembered, but the real question remains: how many more lives were sacrificed before the truth came to light? The Morrison sisters' crimes may have been uncovered, but the scars they left will continue to haunt the community and the world for generations to come.